They mobilized an empire to build something that couldn't make a sound. Over 180,000 workers. Timber hauled 150 miles from the mountains of Lebanon. Gold stripped from desert trade routes and hammered onto every wall, every ceiling, every door. Bronze pillars cast in open fields along the Jordan River and dragged uphill to Jerusalem. 7 years of continuous construction, and the entire time, not a single hammer blow on the building site. Because the command was clear, the house of God would arrive in silence. Every piece finished before it got there. Every stone dressed underground. Every joint already fitted before it touched the hill. 3,000 years ago, Solomon pulled off something that modern engineers still study, and the nation that built it paid for it with its own survival. Stay with this, because the story of how this building went up is only half of what happened. The other half is what it cost, and why the most sacred construction project in the ancient world became the thing that broke a kingdom apart. And the house, when it was in building, was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer, nor axe, nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building. 1 Kings 6:7. Before a single stone was quarried, before a single tree was felled in Lebanon, the temple already existed in stockpiles. David had spent decades building toward it. 1 Chronicles 22:14 records what he told Solomon before the handoff. Now behold, in my trouble I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, and 1,000,000 talents of silver, and of brass and iron without weight, for it is in abundance. Timber also, and stone have I prepared. 100,000 talents of gold. Historians have wrestled with that number for generations. Some calculate modern equivalents running into the hundreds of billions of dollars, while others argue the figures reflect divine provision rather than precise accounting. Archaeologists still debate the exact conversion. What's not in dispute is what David was telling his son: you are not starting from nothing. The weight of this has already been carried. But Solomon still had to build it, and that would require something David couldn't stockpile: skilled hands, living timber, and partners across the known world. Here's something most people don't realize. Solomon's temple was from the very first day a worldwide project. Israel didn't have the craftsmen. The limestone hills of Judea were good for stone, not for the long, straight, aromatic timber a structure like this demanded. So Solomon sent a letter north. 1 Kings 5, verses 2 through 6 records the negotiation. Solomon wrote to Hiram, king of Tyre, the most powerful trading city on the Mediterranean coast. Tyre sat on a rocky island just off the Lebanese shore, surrounded by the sea on all sides, rich from centuries of moving goods between Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. Hiram's Phoenician craftsmen were the finest builders, metalworkers, and sailors of their generation. Solomon's offer was direct: cut cedar and cypress, get it to the coast, and I'll pay in wheat and olive oil. 20,000 measures of wheat per year, 20 measures of fine oil. Hiram agreed, and that's where the real work began.
Picture what the Lebanese cedar trade actually looked like. Phoenician crews climbing into the high ranges above the coast, elevations above 4,000 feet, where trees grew slow and straight and dense, where cedar had been harvested for Egyptian pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings for 1,000 years before Solomon's letter arrived. Teams of men stripping bark, cutting branches, pulling logs down slope on ropes and rollers toward the river valleys below. The logs hit the Litani and Leontes rivers, were lashed into floating rafts, and guided down to the Mediterranean coast. From there, they were floated south along the shoreline and dragged onto the beach at Joppa, modern Jaffa, just south of Tel Aviv. Then came the hardest leg. Jerusalem sits in the Judean hills, roughly 2,500 feet above the coastal plain. Every beam, every cedar plank, every cypress board had to be loaded onto carts and carried uphill into the mountains. 150 miles, door to door, from the forest to the building site. And those materials didn't move themselves. Pull back from the supply lines for a moment and look at the people. 1 Kings 5:13-16 describes what Solomon put together. 30,000 Israelite men drafted in rotating shifts, 10,000 at a time, 1 month in Lebanon, 2 months back home. 70,000 carriers moving materials across the landscape. 80,000 stone cutters working in the hill country. Over 3,000 supervisors managing the whole operation. That's over 180,000 people. Ancient Jerusalem's entire population at this period is estimated between 10 and 30,000 people. The workforce building the temple was larger than the city it served. On any given morning, the roads into Jerusalem were alive with movement. Men carrying stone, men carrying timber, dust rising off the Judean roads, overseers threading between work gangs, and at the center of it all, on Mount Moriah, a building rising in complete silence. And it wasn't all of those workers came willingly. The Israelite men were conscripted in rotating drafts, a burden but not permanent. They went home. The burden fell differently on the Canaanite populations living inside Israel's borders. 1 Kings 9:21 notes these groups became levy of bond service unto this day. What does it mean that the descendants of the enslaved in Egypt built the house of the God who freed them using a labor system that from the outside looked a great deal like the one they had escaped? That question doesn't have a tidy answer, but it's the kind of question this story refuses to let you walk past. And it wasn't the only remarkable thing happening. This is the part of the story that engineers and architects keep coming back to. Every stone in Solomon's temple had to be measured, cut, and finished underground before it was moved a single inch toward the building site, which means the quarry crews weren't just breaking rock. They were working from architectural drawings. They were producing components to exact specification, and they were doing it in the dark. Archaeologists believe the primary quarry sat directly beneath the Temple Mount, a cavern system, sometimes called Solomon's Quarries or Zedekiah's Cave, runs roughly 200 meters beneath the old city, wide enough in sections to feel like a buried cathedral. Quarry marks, tool grooves, and extraction channels, still visible on the walls, trace where generations of cutters worked. Imagine being inside it, torchlight flickering off pale limestone, the careful sound of bronze chisels, not the ring of iron, but something quieter, more deliberate, the smell of dust and oil smoke, the weight of Mount Moriah pressing down from above. Every block leaving that cave was finished, corners squared, faces dressed, dimensions confirmed against the plan, because a mistake made underground could not be fixed at the surface. The commandment allowed no iron tools on the hill. If a stone arrived wrong, it couldn't be trimmed or corrected. It had to go back or be discarded. Modern stonemasons who have studied the project note that what this required wasn't just skill, it was discipline of an unusual kind. The precision had to exist before the stone ever saw light.
The structure itself was modest by imperial standards, roughly 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet tall. A single stone temple on a prepared platform on the crown of a hill. But what covered every surface was something else entirely. So Solomon overlaid the house within with pure gold, and he made a partition by the chains of gold before the oracle, and he overlaid it with gold. And the whole altar that was by the oracle he overlaid with gold. 1 Kings 6:21-22. The walls, The floor, the ceiling, the doors, the altar, all gold. Outside, flanking the entrance, stood two bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz. Each one rose over 27 feet, capped with ornate capitals that added another 8 feet above that. In the courtyard stood the bronze sea, a massive ritual basin nearly 15 feet across, resting on the backs of 12 cast bronze oxen. It held roughly 11,000 gallons of water. Lampstands, altars, basins, utensils, all of it bronze or gold, all of it made by hand. But here's the detail most people never hear. Solomon didn't just ask Hiram of Tyre for timber, he asked for a man. And King Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre. He was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass. And he was filled with wisdom and understanding and cunning to work all works in brass. 1 Kings 7:13-14. This Hiram, not the king, the craftsman, was the son of a Tyrian metal worker and an Israelite mother from Naphtali. He was the product of both worlds that Solomon needed to bring together. And this man set up his operation not in Jerusalem or Tyre, but in the flatlands of the Jordan Valley, in the plains between Sukkoth and Zaratan, where the earth was deep and clay-rich and perfect for casting at scale. Imagine it in the summer heat. Open-air furnaces along the riverbank, clay molds drying in the sun. The twin pillars alone, each over 35 feet of hollow bronze, ornamented with pomegranates and lily-shaped capitals, would have been the most ambitious metalwork any craftsman of that era had ever attempted. When they were finished, they were loaded onto sledges and dragged uphill to Jerusalem, a climb of over 2,000 feet. Then set at the entrance of the house of God and given names: Jachin, Boaz, he shall establish, in him is strength. This is where the story becomes much larger. The temple took 7 years to build. Solomon's palace complex, built alongside it, took 13 years. By the time both were complete, the financial weight of 20 years of imperial construction had settled onto the kingdom like a stone that wasn't going anywhere. The debt to Hiram of Tyre was significant enough that 1 Kings 9:11 records Solomon settling it with territory. Now Hiram, the king of Tyre, had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees and with gold according to all his desire. That then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. 20 cities. Not tribute, not a gift, payment for services rendered. When Hiram traveled north to inspect what he'd received, he wasn't impressed. The land displeased him. He called it Kabul, a name ancient writers understood to mean as nothing. The debt was settled on paper. What Solomon gave away was something else. And the pressure didn't end when construction ended. Everything Solomon had built, the temple, the palace, the chariot cities, the garrison towns, kept running on taxation and conscription, on the continuous weight of a king who kept asking more from a people who had not forgotten what freedom felt like. By the time Solomon died, the resentment had been building for a generation. Jeroboam had already tried to rebel. 1 Kings 12 records what happened when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, rejected the people's plea to ease the burden. The kingdom split in two and never came back together. The temple stood. The kingdom that built it did not. What does it mean when the most sacred project in a nation's history becomes the fracture that breaks it? But before the kingdom fractured, there was one final moment. 7 years, 180,000 workers, timber dragged from the Lebanese mountains, gold from desert trade routes,
bronze poured in the Jordan Valley, stones dressed underground in torchlit silence. Then Solomon gathered all the elders of Israel, and the priests lifted the Ark of the Covenant onto their shoulders, and they carried it up from the city of David into the Holy of Holies. And what happened next is unlike anything else in the ancient record. It came even to pass, as the trumpeters and singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord. And when they lifted up their voice with the trumpets and cymbals and instruments of music, and praised the Lord, saying, "For he is good, for his mercy endureth forever," that then the house was filled with a cloud, even the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of God. 2 Chronicles 5:13 through 14. The priests couldn't stand up, not overwhelmed by emotion, not overcome by the ceremony. The text says the cloud of the presence of God filled the building so completely that the men trained and consecrated to serve in it could not stay on their feet. Everything quarried in silence, floated down rivers, carried over mountains, poured in clay molds, lifted stone by stone without iron. It had been building toward this moment. The silence of construction was not just a rule. It was, in some sense, a preparation, a place where the noise of human ambition stopped and something else filled the space. Solomon's temple stood for roughly 400 years before the Babylonians burned it to the ground in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar's army came through the gates of Jerusalem, stripped the gold from the walls, carried off the bronze pillars that Hiram the craftsman had poured in the Jordan Valley, and left the building in ash and rubble. The ark was never found again. Archaeology has not recovered the temple's physical structure. Later buildings on the same ground have made direct excavation all but impossible. But the quarry caves still exist. Pottery, seal impressions, and inscriptions from Solomon's era confirm the historical reality of the kingdom and its projects. The site is not a myth, it is buried. What survives most completely is the biblical text itself, and what strikes careful readers is its precision. Measurements, materials, craftsmen's names, supply agreements, construction timelines. This reads less like a religious legend and more like documentation someone needed future generations to have in full. Here is what that documentation actually records when you read it without looking away. A building completed in sacred silence, assembled from pieces shaped in darkness by hands that never chose to be there, paid for with land that wasn't worth what it cost, dedicated in a moment so overwhelming the priests fell down inside it, standing for 4 centuries, then gone with a single military campaign.
And the kingdom that commissioned it, the unified Israel that represented the full realization of everything from Abraham's call to David's throne, that kingdom did not outlast the construction debt. It fractured while the temple was still new. It was already 2 rival nations before the cedar beams had fully seasoned. History keeps producing this pattern. The monument endures. The civilization that strained to build it does not. The pyramids are still standing. The pharaohs are not. The Colosseum is still there. The empire that built it dissolved centuries ago. Power consistently outlasts the people who wield it, and the buildings consistently outlast the systems that raised them. But Solomon's temple introduces a dimension that most monuments don't carry. The building wasn't just meant to display power, it was meant to house the presence. And according to the text, it did. Whatever you make of that theologically, the documentary record is unambiguous. The building worked. The cloud came. The priests went down. Which means the full weight of this story isn't in the engineering, or the debt, or the fracture. It's in the gap between those two realities, sitting side by side in the same account. A kingdom that broke itself building a house for God, and a God who showed up in it anyway. That gap between human failure and divine arrival is what this text has been asking readers to sit with for 3,000 years. The stones are still underground. The questions are still open. And maybe that's why Solomon's temple continues to capture the imagination of people 3,000 years later. Not because of the gold, not because of the engineering, not even because of the scale, but because buried inside the story is a tension that never really goes away. A kingdom at the height of its power built a house for God, and yet that same kingdom could not hold itself together. The stones were fitted perfectly. The politics were not. The temple stood. The kingdom fractured. And somehow, in the middle of all of that, the clouds still came. History remembers the builders. Scripture remembers the kings. But the deeper question this story leaves behind is whether human achievement has ever been enough to hold together what only God can sustain. 3,000 years later, the temple is gone. The kingdom is gone. The gold is gone. The cedar is gone. But the questions remain. And some stories don't become smaller with time. They become larger. This was one of them. By the way, what detail in this story changed how you see Solomon's temple? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you've enjoyed exploring the world behind Scripture, there are many more stories still waiting beneath the surface. This was only the beginning.